All right, so let's introduce the skeleton. And since I don't have the model skeleton here, I'm going to use this book for reference again. And I'll also be showing some pictures from the textbook as well. Here's the skeleton. This is the anterior aspect of it, looking forward at the person. And here is the posterior aspect of it. And so the skeleton can be divided basically into two separate parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. And if you think about legs and arms as being appendices, the appendicular skeleton is the legs and arms. Now, the axial skeleton is this. It is the skull, the vertebral column, and the ribs, as well as the sacrum and the coccyx. And that is the extent of the axial skeleton. So this is the anterior and posterior aspect of it. Now, if we want to look and see the appendicular skeleton, it's everything else. So you see the axial skeleton here on page 243 is in yellow, and the appendicular skeleton is everything else. So the hip bones, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the shoulder blade, which we're going to talk about in just a second, which is called the scapula, and the clavicle, which is colloquially known as the collarbone. This is all part of the appendicular skeleton. And so we will now look at the first bone we're going to study, called the scapula. And the scapula is what is colloquially known as the shoulder blade. And here it is. And this one is the left scapula. So let's orient ourselves to the skeleton. Now this is the posterior part of the skeleton, and we can see this is the posterior part of the scapula. And you can see how that matches the left scapula right there. So this is this bone right here. Now we can see that this has a posterior part. This is the part facing backwards, and an anterior part. And to orient ourselves with it, we have to think, well, obviously this is the part where the arm comes out, right? So this is the lateral most part. If we look at it this way, this is the part far away from the midline, where this part here, or this edge, is the medial part. And the medial part is obviously the part closest to the midline. Now, let's talk about some general features of this bone. And so I've got to get my little list, because there are several names for the same thing. Sometimes you'll see, for example, this we'll just talk about right now. That is called the glenoid cavity. That's where your arm bone fits in. And we'll talk about that. It's called the humerus a little bit later, the bone of the upper arm. So this is called the glenoid cavity. Sometimes you will see to it referred as the glenoid fossa. It is the same thing. For this class, we will refer to it as the glenoid cavity. And as you can see, it's the the lateral part of the scapula, because it's where the arm comes out, and the arm is obviously lateral to the body midline. So there are several borders of this thing, and just like countries have borders, this bone has borders, and we can think about our anatomical directions here to identify the borders. So here we are looking from the back again, and it's important to keep your orientation, because if you look at it from the front, it's going to be quite different in how we see it, because now we're looking through the person's body at it from this angle. So now it's here. And it looks quite a bit different from the anterior aspect than it does on the posterior aspect. But we'll look at it from the posterior aspect first, because it's a little bit easier to see. So this thing has borders. So this, you would imagine, would be called the medial border, because it is the border that is closest to the midline. This is the lateral border, because it is the part that is closest to the outside of the body, or the part farthest away from the midline. And that makes sense, because it's where the arm comes out. You don't have your arm coming out of your chest. So this is the lateral border, and then we have this is the superior border, because it's in the direction of up, or the superior direction. Now we see several sharp curves on this thing. This one here, and this one here. These are called angles. Not surprisingly, this curve right here, that's called the superior angle. This one is called the inferior angle. And this, while maybe not quite as easily defined as an angle. This is the lateral angle, but it's still an angle. So those are the three borders and the three angles you need to know. Now let's turn it around and look at it anteriorly, because you can see this feature quite nicely. You see this little notch where I can put my finger? This is called the suprascapular notch. Supra meaning above, and it's sort of above the scapula, or the top part of the scapula. This is the suprascapular notch. Now, we see this large feature right here. This is called the spine. It is the spine of the scapula. This is the superior aspect of it. This is the posterior aspect of it. And this is the inferior aspect of it. Coming off the spine is this piece here. This is the acromion. The acromion, and you think of your acromial region, your shoulder region, this is the acromion. This, which is anterior, on the anteriormost part here, this is the coracoid process. Now there are a few other things we need to know. You see this depression right here, right above the spine of the scapula? This is called the supraspinous fossa. Fossa being a depression. It is the depression above the spine of the scapula. If we look here at this depression, it is the infraspinous fossa, because it is the depression below the spine of the scapula.